Welcome to Jackman Radio. I am your host, Mike Jackman, and today I am joined by the fearless, intrepid journalist, author, and reporter Nick Bryant, author of the Franklin Scandal, as well as a book about the D.C. Madam, and a new forthcoming book about the Epstein case. And remind me what that book's going to be called, Nick?
Actually, the forthcoming book is called The Truth About Watergate, A Tale of Extraordinary Lies and Liars.
Oh, Watergate. Okay, so I made a mistake before we were on air. I thought you were saying you had a book coming out about Epstein, but you've done awesome.
I've launched an initiative called Epstein Justice.
Oh, okay. And you've been looking in the Epstein case since like 2012, right?
Yeah, but with Epstein Justice, what we want is people to demonstrate. We want to go after the perpetrators in the Epstein case.
Because that's the thing with the Epstein case. Obviously, he's been dead since 2019. Ghislaine Maxwell is incarcerated. But, like the meme always says.
Mike, do you want to take it from the top?
Yeah, we're live. I mean, we can just okay. We kind of went right into it. But yeah, Nick Bryant, I've wanted to have you on for a long time. I've been a big fan of your work. You're an inspiration to a lot of people who've come after you in this online, podcast sphere. And I'm glad to see that, it's picking up some steam. Nick's been on El Chapo Trap House. You've been on Tim Dillon. You podcasted with Whitney Webb. You've had many survivors from the Franklin Scandal on your excellent podcast, the Nick Bryant Podcast. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about that show and kind of what you're doing, in that field?
Well, it's interesting how I jumped into the 21st century. A young woman had read the Franklin Scandal, and she sent me an email saying that she'd like to meet me. And now I've had those emails over the years, and some of them are from people who should probably be on psychiatric medication. And but then some of them sound perfectly sane. So, and if they sound sane, I meet them at a restaurant that's very close to my apartment. So I live in New York City, so I can jettison, if the dialogue gets a little too crazy. So I met her. She was a nice young woman, and she said, you have no online presence. And I said, yeah, I'm kind of a troglodytic Luddite. And so she offered to build a website for me. I didn't even have a website. And and she built a nice website, and her boyfriend does a lot of production stuff. And then they offered to help me with a podcast. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And so I've fully leaped into the 21st century at this point. About probably 20 years too late, but at least I'm there. Better late than never.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I mean, your work, like I said, has inspired so many people. And, one thing I wanted to ask you about, and I saw this in one of your podcasts recently or an interview you did. Of course, when True Detective came out in 2015, I was like, whoever wrote this or did this has dug into the Franklin Scandal. And I've been looking at the Franklin Scandal probably since high school, which is, probably not good psychologically for in your teens to start looking at this stuff. But
it's not good if you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s either.
There's no age where it's good. And this is a very dark subject, but it's a very important subject. And of course, with, Sound of Freedom and other things out there, it's in the news, but you got to do so much sussing to get down to the real stuff. And that's what you've done, Nick, with your research and your on the ground work. And so I watched True Detective season 1, been a fan of that show for years. And then I saw you made a comment recently where you actually contacted Nick Puzzoletto on the phone, or you talked to him? Or
I'm good at getting unpublished cell phone numbers.
Yeah, you don't want Nick Bryant looking into you guys. He's going to get in touch.
It didn't seem well. A lot of times they're saying, "How did you get my number? How did you get my number?" And I said, "Well, I'm an investigative journalist, and it's one of the tricks of the trade." And but I was asking him. Actually, the Franklin Scandal was mentioned in True Detective, and I thought
season 3, I think.
What's that?
It was more explicitly mentioned in season 3, I think.
Season 2, yeah. It was explicitly mentioned in season 2. And I thought to myself, well, since he mentions it, I might as well see if he wants to do something with it. And so I called him up, and he said he only does fiction. So even though a lot of True Detective was lifted from the Franklin scandal. I mean, that's my opinion.
I think so too. I mean, at the end there, spoiler alert, 8-year spoiler alert. You know, when Woody Harrelson's like, I don't think we got all of them. And McConaughey's like, we're talking about governors and people way up who are so connected. You know, McConaughey's this niche spewing kind of like, intellectual brooding detective. But, you know, beneath that character facade, the actual meat of the story, it just screams Franklin scandal. So that was surreal to see that on such a large platform on HBO. You must have been kind of freaking out on the inside or been like pleasantly surprised when you first saw that. What was your reaction when you first saw True Detective?
Well, people had told me that True Detective had lifted stuff for the Franklin scandal before I even watched it. And then I watched it and I thought, yeah, they were right.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, whatever form it comes out in, but, you know, I think the podcast form is ultimately going to win the day with the information getting out there. But just to give our audience a little bit on the Franklin scandal. I know we're kind of jumping around a lot. I'm sure there's people watching who are very familiar with it, but I'm sure there's some people who might be the first time they're hearing about it. Can you maybe just kind of give a little bit of information about that, how you got into it, and what kind of the crux of it is?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I'm a journalist, writer. I live in New York City. And I was pitching a Rolling Stone editor for stories. And he said, pitch me dark stories, because I'd written about like serial killers and Hell's Angels and the mafia. And so he saw that I was kind of adept at dancing in the dark. And, dark stories, I mean, I threw my arms up there. I mean, what do you want? Nazi, Satanist? I mean, what do you want? And then he
typical Tuesday night.
And he said, Satanists. So that's what I decided to check out. I had a simple plan. I was going to meet some Satanists, interview them, go to a black mass, write an article, and then get a paycheck. But what is often the case when somebody is looking at a story is they surf the web and look for tangential information. And I came across a U.S. Customs report that was about the finders. And 2 of the finders were busted in a Tallahassee. The finders had a warehouse in Washington, D.C., but 2 of the finders were busted with 6 kids that were just obviously abused, ragamuffins, and concerned Tallahassee citizens called the police. And the police took one look at these 2 guys and one look at the kids, and they immediately arrested the guys. And they were indicted on multiple counts of child abuse. And a doctor said that, and then the children were put in protective services, and a doctor had said that 2 of the children had signs of sexual abuse. So the DC police called the Tallahassee police as soon as they heard about this, and they said, we've been working on the finders for a long time. There's a homicide that seems to point towards the finders, and we've been told that they've done quote unquote blood rituals with children. So ultimately what happened is that U.S. Customs and the Washington, D.C. police executed a search warrant on the finder's warehouse in Washington, D.C. And the reason why U.S. Customs was there is because I think that there was some child pornography in the van, and they certainly came across child pornography. And this was a huge, huge story. And you've got this cult that's trafficking children, and you've got 3 law enforcement entities involved. You've got the DC police, you've got the Tallahassee police, and then you've got U.S. Customs. And ultimately, I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal, and this is what got me into it. And we put the whole report, U.S. Customs report, in the book, the entire report. just to show people that that this is reality. But what happened was on the last page of the report, the U.S. Customs Officer Ramon Martinez says this case has now become an internal CIA case, and no further investigation will be involved. A CIA internal matter, and no further and that just, I mean, that kind of short-circuited me. I thought I knew how the world worked, but with that case, I mean, I was stunned. I was stunned. Why the CIA was going to bat for child molesters.
Yeah, that's really bizarre.
And that opened up my mind to things that my mind wouldn't have readily been open to. And I ultimately traveled to Nebraska. Now, the internet was replete with stories of something like that happening in Nebraska. And so I went to Nebraska, and I was pretty skeptical. I got to admit, I try to approach everything agnostically, but I was pretty skeptical. And now with Nebraska, it was what was said about it was an interstate pedophile network that was hooked up to intelligence, that was hooked up to blackmail, that was plundering Boys Town for underage prostitutes. So, I mean, that U.S. Customs report on the finders kind of opened that door, but I was still, still skeptical, but I was willing to check it out. And I was there a week, and I came across some documents, and I talked to some players, and I had a death threat, and I was followed. And then I realized when I was talking to people about this, this was in 2002. It was like I was talking to, like I was doing a KGB expose on the KGB in Stalinist Russia. There were a lot of people that were terrified to talk to me. And then after I got the documents and I talked to one of the victims and someone who had been a blackmail photographer and just a number of other people, I concluded that it was true. And I went back to New York pretty stunned.
Yeah, one of the people you mentioned, the blackmail photographer, that's Rusty Nelson, right?
Yeah.
Who you ended up going on a trip to Colorado or trying to
Yes.
find or locate photographs or evidence that he said that he had. Now, is this the same fellow that Gary Caradori was visiting
Yes.
to get?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so there had to have been some trepidation or fear. I mean, going down that track.
Absolutely. There was so what happened with the Franklin scandal is social services personnel had reports of an interstate trafficking network, child trafficking network. And they went to state law enforcement, and they went to federal law enforcement, and they were just simply ignored. Nothing happened. So there were two pimps in this network, Lawrence E. King and Craig Spence. King lived in Omaha, Spence lived in Washington, D.C. And King was manager of the Franklin Credit Union that gave loans to lower socioeconomic people. It should have had about $2.5 million in it. But King embezzled $40 million from it. And ultimately what happened, and it hadn't been audited in 4 years. And federally insured credit unions have to be audited every year. So the Nebraska Senate formed a subcommittee to look into the Franklin, how Lawrence E. King was able to embezzle $40 million and why it hadn't been audited. And so they formed this committee, and then these social service personnel came to them and said, that's only part of the story. King is running an interstate pedophile network. And ultimately, the subcommittee hired Gary Caradori, who was an amazing investigator, and he met up with one of the blackmail photographers. His name is Rusty Nelson in Chicago, and Nelson gave him some pictures. And Caradori was flying back and I've got 5 corroborations. I mean, Nelson isn't the paragon of ethics, given what he has done. But I've got 4 other corroborations that Caradori got pictures in Chicago. And he was flying back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and his plane kind of exploded in midair. And he was killed and his son was killed.
Yeah. So, I mean, this stuff's real. People, like we were saying earlier, there's stuff that poisons the well out there, and a lot of it's online. There's no source for it. There's anonymous message boards. There's the poisoning the well with the QAnon stuff. So when you bring this stuff up, people think, oh, this is too fantastic to be real. But, we have Barney Frank. There was a ring being run out of his apartment, and he said, oh, I had no idea about it. It was my roommate, or it was a person.
It was a young lover that was running an escort service out of his apartment.
Right, and he had no idea. We believe that.
Yeah, no.
And then, of course, there's this former Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, who a judge called a serial child predator. And I really feel like a lot of these stories that are actually real and documented and have corroboration, which you mentioned, it gets swept under the rug, or it gets kind of put on page 8 in small print, and then we have stories about UFOs and UAPs kind of distracting everybody. Or whatever the news of the day is. So this real stuff, which is actually explosive, just kind of gets kind of buried, and you don't really hear about it ever again. So do you feel like, because Larry King, he ultimately went down for the financial stuff and nothing related to trafficking, do you feel like even to this day he still has entities protecting him? Oh,
absolutely. King did about 10 years in prison, and then he had a no-show job waiting for him at a BMW dealership outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia. And King has inveigled himself into like 3 organizations that would give him access to children. And I've gotten him kicked out of all 3. Now, I know that there are people in the government that know that he's a super predator, but they've just allowed him to prey on children and keep inveigling himself into these organizations. And what's really a tragedy about this, it has to be a journalist to protect the children when there are people in the government that fully know what he's about.
And you actually got him on the phone once, right? Didn't you call him, or you tracked down his number? Or
I called him, but he said he wasn't him. So apparently he didn't want to talk to me. I don't think Larry likes me too much.
Do you think he still has compromise on politicians and powerful people, and that's why they're protecting him, or is it because they're like, what do you think it is? Like, what's the heart of the matter?
I think he did good service for some dark, malignant corner of our intelligence that compromises people. And Craig Spence committed suicide. I think that Craig Spence was given the option, either he could kill himself or he'd be killed. And there were a number of people that are involved in the Franklin scandal that killed themselves. But I think King was told if he kept his mouth shut, then he'd get out of prison and there'd be a no-show job waiting for him. So, and he's obviously still protected. I mean, the government is letting him inveigle himself into organizations that give him access to children. I mean, a super predator like him.
Yeah, the information and details in your book about him and what he did is just truly horrifying. I don't even want to repeat it on the show, but for people interested, please check out the book, The Franklin Scandal, and the one previous to that by John DeCamp, The Franklin Cover-Up. And in your book, you detail meeting with John DeCamp. But by that time, he seemed to be pretty, maybe not jaded, but like, hey, I've been through this, and good luck and stay safe, basically.
Yeah, I mean, he was helpful with some documents. John DeCamp was a very flawed man, but he helped me a little bit.
Yeah. So with Rusty Nelson, he never ultimately produced any evidence for you, or it was kind of ended up being a wild goose chase after you got pulled over?
Rusty took me on a wild goose chase, and but it was kind of interesting. We did get pulled over by Nebraska State Patrol, who were one of the law enforcement entities that covered up the Franklin scandal. And Nelson and I mean, we were just summarily escorted out, and I was deposited in a police car, and Nelson was deposited between 2 police cars. and they ripped my rental car apart. So they were obviously looking for something. And Nelson told me, as after they had ripped my rental car apart, he said, "You know how lucky you are when we were driving away?" And what he meant by that is, you are very lucky you didn't get pictures, because bad things would have happened to us. So.
Yeah, God, that's hairy. And so Craig Spence was really the DC East Coast, part of this whole deal. And in your research, and I've read, he was given access to the White House for late night tours.
Yes, actually, he took male escorts on late night tours of the White House.
When Bush Sr. was president.
What's that?
When Bush Sr. was president, right? Or Reagan?
Yes, Bush Sr.
Bush Sr. Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Spence was also a nasty piece of work, and he had a mansion in the Kalorama section of Washington, D.C., and he was a CIA asset, and he would throw parties, and there were every room in his home was wired for audiovisual blackmail. So he was like what we're seeing with the Epstein case, where every home that Epstein had hidden cameras. Same thing with Spence.
Yeah, he was kind of like the proto-Epstein.
Yes, or one of many Epsteins, I think. And the thing is, like, there would be outright parties that would be just filled with children and debauchery, but he was also a blackmail artist, like Epstein. And he would have parties where the cream of the crop would be invited to these parties. The upper echelon of politicians, the upper echelon of captains of industry, of media, and it would just be like a straight Washington, D.C. cocktail party. And at maybe 10 or 11, after people had been plied with a lot of alcohol, someone would do something sexually inappropriate, or someone would spark up a joint or break out a line of coke or something like that. And the people that were appalled by that would split, and then the people that stayed, they would be compromised.
Yeah, so he had everything being filmed behind a one-way mirror, right? He had like all this equipment, like video cameras, and
he had a bunch of monitors in a room that was behind a one-way mirror. Yeah.
And that reminded me, you're talking about the finders. Didn't the finders have like a bunch of equipment and monitors and their own like an intelligence apparatus with like printouts coming in and just like up-to-date information in a room?
Yeah, there was printouts coming out about said keep the kids moving through various law enforcement jurisdictions. So that message must have been coming to a number of computers, or that's what U.S. Customs concluded. And what's kind of mind-boggling about that was in 1987. So they had some pretty amazing technology for 1987.
Yeah, even back then. I mean, imagine what it looks like now. Now that Epstein's, that's been pinched, and obviously this doesn't stop with Epstein. I mean, there's got to be other stuff going on here in America and globally. Like, they've probably had to change some tactics, but I don't know. Now that a lot of this has been exposed, I mean, do you feel like it's gone even more underground, or what do you think?
How has it been exposed? I mean, it really. I mean, Franklin was successfully covered up. 2 grand juries said that there was no child abuse. And I don't know if your listeners or viewers are familiar with the grand jury process, but in the grand jury process, it's notorious to corrupt because a special prosecutor is chosen, and then he is the one that presents evidence to grand jurors. And grand jurors are just people that have shown up for jury duty and been funneled to a grand jury. So it's up to the special prosecutor to call the witnesses and show the evidence. So if the special prosecutor wants an indictment, he'll get them to indict. If he doesn't want an indictment, he won't get them to indict. There was a famous quote from a New York Supreme Court justice. He said that special prosecutors have so much power over grand juries that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. So those two grand juries, and I scored the sealed testimony and documents to one of those grand juries, and I brought people into, in the book, The Franklin Scandal, I brought people into that grand jury and just showed them how corrupt it was.
Yeah, I mean, what happened to Alicia Owen, you've detailed that brilliantly, and that's such a, I mean, yeah, the ones who did survive, it just destroyed their lives. And, you know, in this case, these young people, they're the ones who ended up going to prison and being charged. And
well, there was one that there were two kids that the FBI pressured to recant, and they wouldn't recant. One was Paul Benassi and one was Alicia Owen. Paul was indicted on 3 counts of perjury, which carried state perjury, which carried 60 years. And Alicia was indicted on 8 counts of perjury, state perjury, that carried 160 years. And then she was indicted on 8 counts of federal perjury, which carried 40 years. So Alicia Owen, this young girl who was 20 years old when she came forward, was looking at 200 years in prison. And she still refused to recant accounts of her abuse, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that's very brave. And you know, you mentioned Paul Benassi. He also seems to be connected to the Johnny Gosch case. And I watched that documentary a few years ago, Who Took Johnny? And you've had some updates on that case. Can you illuminate that a little bit and how that connects over to Franklin through Paul Benassi?
What happened was, because the FBI and Department of Justice really worked very hard to cover up that trafficking network, because if the dominoes had started to fall in Omaha, Nebraska with that Senate subcommittee, then they would have fallen all the way to Washington, D.C. Because there were upper echelon people in the Bush administration and also a number of other powerful people that were implicated as abusing these kids. So the FBI came in and got everybody to shut up with a lot of threats. And then people saw what happened to Alicia. She was sentenced between 9 and 15 years for perjury and did 2 years in solitary confinement. I mean, the authorities really wanted to crush her. So according to state and federal law enforcement, although this network pandered scores and scores of children, according to state and federal law enforcement and Wikipedia, not a single child was abused by this network. So, and there were people that were part of this network that abducted a paper boy in 1982 named Johnny Gosch. And because the FBI was so committed to covering up that network, they also covered up the Johnny Gosch abduction. And I recently showed where Johnny Gosch was held after he was abducted, and the guy who owned the house was an inveterate pedophile. I gave that information to law enforcement, but law enforcement, and the guy who I gave it to had been a police chief in a Southern California town, and he actually headed an anti-trafficking task force. And he was really interested in pursuing this story, but then all of a sudden the emails stopped and the phone calls wouldn't be returned. So he was obviously, something happened to him, because I have a lot of evidence, and he was gung-ho initially.
And that's frustrating. You've been at this for so long, Nick. I mean, it's, you know, when I say it's out there, I mean like your work and people like you who've done the digging have gotten it out there for the people. And I think it's up to everyone out there who becomes aware of this information to try and publicize it and broadcast it and share it with people. I mean, you know, obviously the authorities and the powers that be aren't going to do anything about it, even if there occasionally are good ones on the inside. Then it's really up to the people, you know, us as a society, on how we're going to deal with this.
Well, we should actually, because nothing has happened to the Epstein perpetrators, and there's a bunch of perpetrators in the Epstein case, because nothing has happened to them. We've formed a 501c3 nonprofit organization called Epstein Justice. And your viewers can go to our website, epsteinjustice.com, epsteinjustice.com, and actually we'll give you an opportunity to help us and help yourselves fight this battle, so we don't have to deal with a government that covers up for child molesters anymore.
Yeah, it's obviously not just our government. I mean, you have, Prince Andrew, who was, named years ago by Virginia Giuffre, and ultimately they settled, right? I think before she shuffled off down below, the Queen helped Andrew with like 12 million pounds or something to make it go away.
I think it was $12 million.
So it's just crazy to me that people still worship institutions, like the royal family, when they have such a deep history with this type of thing. It's like there's two realities that exist. There's a reality where these people do this to the innocent and the helpless, and then there's the reality where people put all these people up on a pedestal. And that's probably one of the reasons why they get away with it. Like a guy like Jimmy Savile or Lawrence King, because he was coming up in the Republican Party in the early 80s. They're connected, and that there's a public image of them that they're actually great people and they do great things for the community. And even in some cases, maybe they do have things that are good they do some good to make it look like they're benevolent across the board.
Yeah, guys like that, they have roads and parks and airports named after them, but they're evil to the marrow.
Yeah, I mean, if they can down Gary Caradori's plane with his young son aboard, and yeah, it's awful. So, kind of switching topics a little bit, you mentioned you have a new book coming out about Watergate. What's the story on that? Do you have like a different take on that, or?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. My spelunking into CIA honey traps led me to at the heart of Watergate is a CIA sexual blackmail operation. And people don't know about that because the mainstream media has covered it up. But when those burglars were found, the burglars broke into the Democratic National Committee, which was housed in the Watergate hotel. The Watergate was a huge office building, hotel, and apartments. And the burglars. Okay, so if you were a Democratic big shot and you wanted to spend a night with or spend some time with a prostitute, there was a secretary at the Democratic National Committee that would give you an album. And this is in the early 70s, late 60s. So we're a long way away from the internet. But she'd let you page through the album. And if you found one you liked, then you could, about a block and a half away was the Columbia Plaza Apartments. And that was a CIA honey trap. So that, and if you went to the Columbia Plaza and saw one of those prostitutes, you'd immediately be compromised. And now the burglars had their photography, they had a bunch of photography equipment, and it was set up on her desk, on that secretary's desk. And one of the burglars had a key to the drawer that held the album. So, and there have been books that have been written about Watergate that have talked about this. But I wanted to write a book about Watergate that was easier to follow than most of the books, because most of the books are tomes, and you kind of need to study them. You don't really read them. You need to study them.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I haven't really done a huge deep dive into Watergate, but I've heard some researchers say it almost looked cartoonish, like with leaving the tape in the door, and like they almost wanted to be caught, or they wanted to make it look like something else. Is that kind of the angle you're going at, to kind of cover up the blackmail component of it?
Well, the blackmail component was just okay. So James McCord was one of the burglars, and he also oversaw that CIA blackmail operation. And he did his best to get caught. I mean, what had happened with the Nixon administration, Nixon was making overtures to Russia and also China. And he wanted to he wanted to start working on nuclear arms reduction with the Russians. And then he wanted to open up China for diplomatic relationship with China and business relationships. And the hawks in the government didn't like that at all because they didn't trust the Russians or the Chinese. And the Russians or the Chinese. So Nixon was conducting these negotiations on a top secret communication system called SD-1 because he didn't want the Joint Chiefs of Staff to know what he was doing. And actually, when Nixon in his one of his first decrees, I think it was National Security Memorandum 1 or 2 or something, Nixon basically said, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the State Department will have no input on my geopolitical moves. So basically, he was telling them all to go to hell and that he was going to become a peacemaker. He wanted to be a great man. He wanted to be a peacemaker. And then so the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually executed an espionage ring against Nixon. and Nixon was able to, they ultimately got busted, but then the CIA just started, infiltrating the Nixon administration. And it was James McCord, one of the guys who really hated Nixon, who was head of the burglary team. He did his best to get caught. And that was the beginning of the end for the Nixon administration.
Yeah, Russ Baker's delved into this. Another guy I've had on the podcast a couple of times, and I've kind of come to think about Watergate through my limited understanding and research into it, that Nixon was set up in a way. Yes, he was paranoid or corrupt, whatever you want to call him. He recorded everything. Kissinger was, he had Kissinger in there. They did the secret bombing campaigns, but with ping pong diplomacy, you think maybe he was kind of trying to head towards a more dovish take on the world stage, huh? And that's... I
do. He backed some very genocidal dictators, Pinochet in Chile and Suharto in Indonesia, and his bombing of Cambodia played an integral role to the Khmer Rouge coming to power. So he was a little schizophrenic, but what he really wanted to do was become a peacemaker with Russia and China. And the CIA wasn't going to let that happen.
Yeah, they don't care who's in there. It seems like even when Trump said the slightest thing about diplomacy, or let me look, Nick, I'll get my jet, I'll go over to North Korea, I'll talk to Rocket Man, we'll have a burger together, we'll do the walk to remember. Like, ultimately, they didn't achieve anything, but I'm sure there's 20 million people in North Korea who were glad that no bombs were dropped. And that's I don't care who the president is, that's a good thing. So maybe he was trying to take a page out of Nixon's book.
Well, with Nixon, had Watergate not happened, he would have sailed into history as a great president. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and there's an interesting recording, too, of him where he refers to the whole Bay of Pigs thing. So clearly, this is a man who had information on the intelligence agencies. When he was VP under Eisenhower, he was deeply involved in that stuff.
Well, he was aware that the CIA played an integral role in killing John Kennedy.
Yeah.
And actually, so the FBI was starting to dig into Watergate, and Nixon essentially told the CIA, you dig into Watergate, and we'll start digging into JFK and the JFK assassination. And that was one of the counts of obstruction, was using the CIA to block the FBI.
Yeah, he was signaling. Did you hear kind of in the later years of his life, he was on the outs with the Bohemian Grove? There's that great recording of him where he's like, I got to tell you, that Bohemian Grove that I attend from time to time has got to be one of the most GD things you can imagine. And they didn't let him come back because he refused to stay at one of their lower camps, and he refused to apologize. He'd been a member, I think, since probably the early 50s. So that was pretty interesting.
He was never fond of Bohemian Grove.
The San Francisco crowd, Nick, I wouldn't shake hands with any of them.
Yeah.
He cops to it on the tape, though, like attending from time to time. It's just funny, the behind the scenes of how politics actually work. And, that's why I wanted to talk to you today, man, because I really think this is Republican, Democrat, that's team baseball, man. That's blue team versus red team. It's mostly kabuki theater. The real nitty gritty is the blackmail and the compromise that these people get on each other. And, tragically, it hurts innocent people and a lot of the times children. So, that's why I think it's important for people to understand that when studying American history. Because, as Whitney Webb details, and I know you've talked to her, the Epstein thing really goes back to what's his face there? Roy Cohn. And even before him, he was part of something in New York City that was bugging hotels and rooms. And it's just been going on since the beginning of the political process.
Has been practiced forever in this country. It's kind of like a muckraking journalist outed Alexander Hamilton for having an affair with a woman who is 23 years old and married. And her husband knew about Hamilton, and he was shaking Hamilton down. And this muckraker outed Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton were foes. And so the muckraker thought that Jefferson would give him an appointment in his administration. And when Jefferson didn't, he outed Jefferson for having sex with one of his slaves. So this country has had political blackmail since its early genesis.
Yeah, definitely. And I read too that Nixon actually had a girlfriend, a Chinese girlfriend, or a girlfriend over in Vietnam, or
it's difficult to know with Nixon. It's entirely possible, but I don't think he was that kind of a guy. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I don't know. I've read too that ultimately through all this, you still are hopeful, and you have to be hopeful and optimistic. And I tend to agree with that. And I use humor to deal with all this. And I know that you also have a good dark sense of humor. Where do you see us going as a country? The next election, and is that just a beauty pageant in your mind, or do you think there could be consequences, potentially consequences for who gets in there? What do you think?
I don't vote for Republicans or Democrats at this point. I think the system is so corrupt and perfidious that, but that's why we started Epstein Justice, because our thoughts on that is, you can go to EpsteinJustice.com and you can sign a petition that has nearly 37,000 signatures. And we also have software where you can put your name in, your email, and where you live, and then press send, and it'll go automatically to your legislators, your federal legislators, the letter that we've composed. So what we're shooting for is a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And what we mean by reconciliation is accountability. And I think that if enough Americans come forward, if enough Americans are part of Epstein Justice, if we drill into the Epstein thing with a reconciliation commission, we're going to come across a cesspool that is our government, that calls the shots, that produces laws that cause extreme wealth polarization amongst Americans, and also tramples on our constitutional rights. So that's why EpsteinJustice.com is so important.
Yeah, definitely. Because I really believe most Americans are good people, and they're appalled by this. And when they learn about the behaviors, the elite deviance that goes on, but oftentimes we do feel helpless. We don't know what to do. We have our lives, our hamster wheels, our 40-hour, 50-hour a week hamster wheels that we're on, bills, and that's one way they got us squeezed, to not really look deeply into the stuff and try and suss it out. So I think that's a great tool and a great place to start with that. So when's the Watergate book coming out?
A couple of months. Looking forward to that.
Awesome. Are you going to be doing it
about Epstein Justice? But I am excited to get this Watergate book out.
Yeah, absolutely. Onto the Epstein thing too, man. It's like like you were saying, okay, Epstein's dead, Ghislaine's in jail, but what about all everyone else that was involved? There's been stuff in the news about Bill Richardson and Prince Andrew. There's been names named. You, of course, famously released the Black Book on via Gawker.
Yes.
And that started a ripple effect in this thing, and that was probably what 8 years ago.
It was in 2015. I originally got the Black Book in 2012, and I was pitching it to mainstream magazines, and no one wanted to touch it. And then finally, Gawker put out the Black Book, and I was very happy about that.
How did you get a hold of that, Nick? Do you mind sharing that, or would you rather not share how you got it?
It's you got to keep your sources kind of.
I respect that.
It's helpful.
I respect that, but I do know for one of the Black Books, or one address book, a fellow who worked for Epstein was trying to sell it, and he passed away. Maybe not related to the case, but
well, what happened was, okay, so there were a number of attorneys that were launching civil suits at Epstein, and Alfredo Rodriguez was the house manager of Epstein's home and his property in Florida, and he was trying to sell the Black Book to one of the attorneys that was part of the civil suits against Epstein. And the lawyer ultimately called the FBI, and the FBI did a sting. And then he had people that he thought were in cahoots with Epstein, with the children's, their names circled. And then there was probably at least 150 victims also. And then, I called the victims, and I realized because at that point, the media was just looking upon Epstein like as a lone pedophile.
Right, it's just him. Yeah.
Yes. But then I started calling out these victims, and I realized, he's flying kids around. I mean, he's flying them to this island. And at that point I realized, although I pretty much knew beforehand because of the legal aberrations, it was a grand jury. The state, the Palm Beach Police Department had found 23 victims, underage victims of Epstein. And the state grand jury only called one. And the special prosecutor skewered her. So that grand jury concluded that Jeffrey Epstein hadn't molested a single child, which is, and when there's those kind of legal aberrations, like with the Franklin scandal, you could tell that they were covering up something. So when I got the Black Book and I started calling victims, I realized this is a network. Epstein was head of a network.
Yeah, and then that famous quote from Acosta, during the confirmation for his secretary post. Oh, I couldn't really do anything with Epstein. I was told he was intelligence and it's above my pay grade. And that kind of sums it up in a lot of ways.
Well, Acosta was the U.S. attorney, and by that time, the feds had a list of 36 underage victims. And Acosta was told to stand down because Epstein was intelligence. Now, here's how powerful the people were that quashed that investigation. Constitutionally, there's only two people in the country that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One's the president and one's the attorney general. So those orders came from on high.
So who would have been in, what was that, 07 or 08 at the time? So that would have been Bush or Obama?
It was, actually, 4 administrations have covered it up. Bush one.
Since Clinton, yeah.
Trump and Biden. And we've got 435 federal representatives in the House, and we've got 100 senators. So there are 535 legislators in Washington, D.C. that are ostensibly looking out for Americans. And not one of them has called for an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. 4 administrations have not called for 2 Republican, 2 Democrat have not called for an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. And that's why Epstein justice is so important. Is, we have to take the bull by the horns and do something about this.
Yeah, it's got to be the people, because otherwise they're just going to continue having hearings about steroids in baseball and flying saucers, the UFO psyop, which I think it's all BS. Ultimately, I think it's a distraction, just another distraction being sent down the pipe, to distract from real important stuff and the real essence of power and corruption in our country. So, all right, Nick. Well, I really appreciate your time today. So, apart from the Epstein project, where can people find your work? How can they support you? Where can they see your stuff?
You can go to my website, nickbryantnyc.com, and definitely go to epsteinjustice.com and help us out.
Absolutely. And before we go, I do have a couple chats if we want to look at that really quick.
Sure.
All right, we'll get your response. R1 Gambler says, Watergate, CIA coup, simple as. Yeah.
It was a CIA silent coup, no doubt about it.
McCord wanted to be caught. That was his purpose. The other plumbers were dupes. Now, was that like G. Gordon Liddy? He was one of the other plumbers, and E. Howard Hunt?
Yeah, Hunt was in on it, but Liddy, they had bamboozled Liddy.
Yeah, I think Liddy just died fairly recently,
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they ultimately gave him like his own TV show, and he ended up having a pretty good career.
Radio show, yeah.
Yeah, it's like Oliver North, sell out your country, help sell out your country, we'll give you a show.
Indeed.
Nixon was a populist, unacceptable to the machine then and now. Okay. And we got one more here.
If you look at what Nixon did, I mean, he tried to pass universal health care for Americans. He started the Environmental Protection Agency. He started OSHA. He was going to give like a minimum wage allowance to people. I mean, there were a number of liberal things that Nixon did. Now, I'm not a Nixon apologist, but
right.
I think that if Nixon ran today, he'd be considered a liberal.
Probably, yeah. I mean, there's a reason Roger Stone has his tattoo on his back there.
Yes.
They were bros. And then Les Wexner is the Epstein thread to pull. It unravels it all. Yeah, Wexner's definitely a key player. Well,
Wexner is one of those guys that Epstein justice, I mean, that the government needs to go after. And until we have, the thing about it is, we are going to, do we want our children to be given a government, to inherit a government that protects pedophiles? I mean, do we want our children to be in that kind of government?
Yeah, that's the question. Apart from all the mudslinging and the name calling and all the sensationalism, it's like, bottom line, man, a lot of these people are really evil, and they're vacuous and soulless, and they're all about money and power, and they don't care who they got to destroy to get there. It's a sad state of affairs, but I still think the whole deal is salvageable. Our country, and like I said, most people are inherently good, and they don't want this thing in our system. So we're going to continue talking about it, Nick. And again, thank you so much for your amazing work and research. You've inspired a lot of people, myself included, and we'll keep doing our best to get it out there.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a great day.
All right, thank you, and thank you everybody for watching Jackman Radio. We'll see you next time.